Hello guys, today I'm going to continue on our notes. This is notes 1.07, still talking about function notation, but this is part 2 of our notes. And I just want to mention again, if you feel like you already understand what you're supposed to do throughout the examples, then try out the examples before you watch this video, and you can just check how you did when watching the video, right? That way you don't have to watch the whole time segment of it. You can skip around if you need to, and it saves you time overall, right? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to be able to interpret function notation to find the missing value, either x or y, because last time we talked about how function notation is written in a certain form, right? When we were talking about function notation, it looked like this: f of x equals y. And so f was the name of the function. Sometimes they might call the graph or the function f. They might use the letter g or h, which is what we might see today in the notes. But we're trying to be able to interpret this notation and using this notation to find the missing x or y that we're looking for either in the table or in the graph. Okay. And so before we look at the examples, I want to talk about different ways that functions can be represented. And what I mean is, like I said, they can call them different names. And so it says the axes on the coordinate plane are written as x and y, the xy axis, right? If the graph is a function, the axis on the coordinate plane can be written using x and f of x, g of x, h of x. So this is what I was talking about. They might call it f, g, or h, and they'll usually write it in the graph, and I'll show you where they might write it. Or they might use a single letter, f, g, or h, without the parentheses and the x. So these three pictures kind of give you an example of how they might write it, right? So they might give you the x and the y axis, and then they have the graph, this blue line, and next to the graph they'll have the name of the graph, in this case f of x. Or they might have the blue graph, and one axis might be called x, and the other one, instead of calling it y, they call it g of x. This is the name of this function, okay? And then the last type of situation we might have is that they might label the axis x and y, and then they'll draw the graph, and next to the graph they have just a single letter. So this is function h. So this blue one is function g. This blue line going down is function f. Okay. And again, feel free to pause the video at any points. So let's look at the first example. The first example has 5 parts to it. So let's look at it. It says, use the graph of h to fill in each of the blanks below. And so they labeled the axis, this axis x, and this vertical axis is my y-axis. And then this blue graph is called h. Okay, so they're saying the graph of h, this graph. If you remember from algebra, the name of this graph is a parabola, or the shape is a parabola. Okay. Now, function notation, and I'm going to use the letter h for this one. So think of it as h parentheses x equals y. So remember the beginning of the video I put f. Here I'm putting h. This is the name of the graph, the name of the function. Okay, so let's look at the first example. It says h1. h parentheses 1. So 1, we might interpret it as, pick a color here. We might say, oh, well, that means that x equals 1. Because the number inside the parentheses is x. So on the graph, when I go to x equals 1 on the x-axis, I'm right here. Well, where is it touching the graph? At this location. What is this location? It's 1, 0. So I'm going to say this is the location. I'm going to call this point A because we're working on letter A, right? So this is point A, and what are the coordinates of this point? It's 1, 0. So if x is 1, what's my y? 0. And where should I write the y? After the equals sign. So I'm going to put in this space, I'm going to put my y value, and we said it's 0. Okay, so let's try the next one. What's the number inside the parentheses? -1. But the number inside the parentheses is represented as x. So it's telling me that, x equals -1. So I'm going to go on my x-axis and look for -1, and it's right here. Now, where is the graph? If I scan up and down on x equals 1, where do I find the graph? Oh, I find it up here. That's at 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to call this point B because we're working on example B, and I'm going to call it B. But what's the location of that point? What's the coordinate of that point? I don't like my parentheses today. Okay, it's going to be -1, 4. You know what? I'm going to rewrite it again because I don't want it to get in the way of the x-axis. So I'm going to say this point B is located at -1, 4. So if -1 is my x, what's my y? 4. So I get my y here, my y here. Okay, let's try it again. For letter C, x equals 0. So the question is, what is my y value going to be? So let's go on the x-axis and let's look for 0. And 0 is right here on the x. And if I scan up or down, where do I see the graph? The blue line is right here. So I'm going to label this point C. And the location of this point is x equals 0, 3. So my y value is 3. Okay. Now notice for the last two, D and E, the way that the equation is written is different. Notice that that inside the parentheses we have an x, and after the equal sign is a number, and the question is, what is x? So they're switching the question on us. They're giving us y, because remember, after the x, after the equal symbol is a y. So my y value, so they're telling me y equals 0. Saying y equals 0. And they're saying if y equals 0, what's my x value? So then, now let's go on the y-axis and look for y equals 0. And so that's right here. And so where on my graph do I hit if I scan left and right? Well, I hit here and I hit over here. So there's 2 points, 2 locations where y equals 0. This location, I guess I'll call it D. And that location, it looks like it's at -3, 0. Right? -3, 0. So these 2 points have the same y value, right? Y equals 0 on this point, y equals 0 on this point. So which x values am I going to write here? Well, I'm going to write the 2 x values for these 2 points. So I'm going to write the x value of -3 for this point, and the x value of 1 for this point. So I'm basically saying that I have 2 answers. I have -3 and 1. Right, so there's 2 points on the graph that have a y value of 0. There's 2 points on the graph that have a y value of 0. Okay, let's try the last one. The last one looks like letter E looks like letter D. That means that 5 is my y. So I'm going to put, y equals 5. And the question is, what is x equal to? So I'm going to go on my y-axis and look for 5. And I see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's up here. And it's asking me for x values. So x values, we can find them to the left or to the right. But I see a problem here. If I scan to the left and the right, does the graph exist up here? It does not, right? So at this y value, go ahead and circle it. At y equals 5, the graph doesn't exist. So we can write, undefined. Because there's no, the graph doesn't exist up here. So there are no x values that have a y value of 5 on the graph. Because the maximum that the graph reaches is 4. Okay. All right, so let's go to the next example. And again, if you have questions, we're going to go over those in the class session. I can answer any questions you may have. Okay. Example 2. Now we're going to use a different graph. The graph itself, the picture, is different, and they changed the name. It's no longer called H, it's called G, and they went ahead and put the name on the y-axis. The x-axis is called x. Okay, so I'm going to make a note here, right here where it says graph of g of x. I'm going to make a note that we're going to be using this function notation of g of x equals y. So we're going to put g of x, parentheses x, equals y. Okay, and then we have a similar idea as before, where here they're giving us the number inside the parentheses, so that number represents x. So here they're saying if x equals, sorry, let me use black ink. If x equals 1, So I'm going to go to my x-axis and look for 1. What is my y value? So if I look for my y going up, there's a hole there. So it's like if there's no point on the graph if I go up. But what if I go down? Oh, I do find a point. And I'll call that point A. Since we're on question A. And what's the location of that point? What's the coordinate of that point? It looks like 1, -2. So this point is at 1, -2. So at this point, the x value is 1, and the y value is -2. Okay. Next one, letter B. Here they're saying x equals -2. So I'm going to go along my x-axis and look for -2. And I'm going to scan up and down for y's, or for points on the graph. So here I see that I hit the graph at that location. I'm going to call that location B, and that has a x coordinate of -2 and a y coordinate of +2. So my y value is 2. Let's go to C. C changes the format of the question. Now they're giving us the number after the equal sign, and after the equal sign we should find the y value. So they're telling us in letter C that if y equals 0, then what is the x? Okay, so I'm going to go scan through my y values and look for 0, which is right here. And then I'm going to check to my left and my right because I'm looking for x's, and the x-axis goes from left to right, right? So if this is y equals 0, and I go to my left and my right, how many points do I run into? Well, I run into this point here, and this point. So 1, 2, 3 points. Okay, what are the x values of those points? Those are my answers. What are the x values of those points? Okay, so the first point is located at 1, 2, 3, -3. So I'm going to write that down, -3, comma. What's the x value of the next point? That looks like 1, 2. And the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4. And notice this is not, because I'm putting a comma, it doesn't mean that I'm talking about domain. I'm just listing my answers. And I have 3 answers because there's 1, 2, 3 points that I seem to run into. Okay, so I'm just listing my answers with commas, right? So I'm saying my x's are -3, 2, 4. And there's no parentheses, there's no brackets, because we're not talking about domain here. Okay, next example. Here we're saying that our y value is -4. We're saying y is equal to -4. So I'm going to scan my y-axis and look for -4. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 right here. And I'm going to scan for x's. So that means I'm going to scan to my left and to my right. But if I scan to my left and my right, there's no graph down here. So if there's no graph, I say it's undefined. All right. Letter E is similar to, I think it was lesson 1.05, where they're asking us for a slope. And remember, slope is rise over run on the interval -4, -1. So now you see that we have brackets here. So now these numbers represent a domain. So interval means that this represents a domain. And I can even say similarly for the next example, right? Domain again. Okay, since we're using the same graph, I'm going to erase what I wrote earlier, and you can go back in the video and kind of go back if you want to see what I wrote there previously. Okay, so we're looking between -4 and -1. So those are x values. So I'm looking between -4 and -1. And remember, when I'm thinking about domain, thinking about this idea of scanning from left to right. And so I want to scan between -4 and -1. And so what part of the graph am I focusing on? Well, let me highlight it in purple. This part right here. So between -4 and -1. That's the piece of the graph that I'm interested in. Okay. All right, so the question is, what is the slope? How do I get from the bottom to the top here? Well, I need to rise, and then I need to run. How many steps did I rise? Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let me double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. And then I ran 1, 2, 3 to the right. All right, so that gives me a slope of 6. Actually, let me color code it just for you guys. So 6 divided by 3. 6 divided by 3 equals, if I can simplify it, then I should, right? So 6 divided by 3 equals to 2. So my answer is 2. And again, feel free to pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and erase my work so that I can look at the next example. The next example is, again, it's asking for slope. So just remember, slope is rise divided by run. And we're looking at the interval between -1 and 0. So between -1 and 0. And so the piece of the graph that I'm interested in is this small piece right here. We're interested in this piece. All right, so then let's look at it. It's rise over run, right? So think about it. To go from this point to this point, did I rise anything? No, right? My rise was 0. So I'm going to write a fraction, rise divided by, so rise divided by run. How much did I run? How much did I go from left to right? Looks like 1 unit, right? 1 unit. So what is 0 divided by 1? Well, 0 divided by anything is 0. So my slope is 0 for this piece of the line. Okay. Awesome. All right, the last example. The last example is dealing with a table. So the question is, if I have a table, can I do the same thing? Can I find, the missing values of the function notation? And so notice I have x values, I have y values. And I can write these as a coordinate, right? 9, 4, or 8, 4, or 2, 9. So these are points. And so in this first example, letter A, it's saying that if x equals -3, so let me write it. Let me go ahead and write the function notation again up here so that we remember what it looks like. And so inside the parentheses is our x value. So here, -3 is my x. So if x equals -3, they're asking me what should I put in this blank. But remember, after the equal sign is my y value. So if I look at my x's in this table, do you see a x equals -3? Yes, right? And what's the y value that corresponds to it? 2. So that's my answer. Let's try it again. Example B. The value inside the parentheses is my x. So they're saying x equals 20. So I'm going to go on my table and look for x equals 20. Well, it's right here. What's the y value that corresponds to this 20? 0. So my y equals 0. So we're just following this format, and after the equal sign is my y. Okay, next one, x equals 8. X equals 8, scanning. Oh, I missed it. It's right here. X equals 8, that means my y value is 4. And the last one, x equals -1. So I'm scanning my x values. Do you see a -1? I can't find it. Nope, there's no -1. So if something is not there, if I can't find it, it's not defined. So I'm going to put undefined. Undefined. All right, now let's look at the examples on the right side here. And notice how they're different than the examples on the left. The examples on the left, they all had a value inside the parentheses, but the values on the right have an x inside the parentheses because that's what we're looking for. And what do we usually write after the equal sign? Our y values. Or you can think of it, in the table, if you notice, it gives us the f of x. But that's why we said, f of x equals y, because these are all, the second row of values are all the y values. The second row of values are all the y values. So this is basically saying that if my y value is 9, what's my x value? Well, I'm going to look at my second row of numbers. And I'm looking for 9. And I found it right here. And so what's the x value that corresponds to 9? Because remember, this first row are x's. So 9 corresponds with 2. So my x value is 2. Next one, y equals 4. So I'm going to scan my second row and look for 4. Hey, I got 2. There's two values for y equals 4. What x's do they have? Well, one of them has a 9 and the other one has an 8. So those are 2 answers. So for this example, I have an answer of 9 and an answer of 8. Because there's 2 x's with the same y value. Okay, next one. F of x equals 0. F of x, which of these is 0? It's the last one. And what x value does it correspond to? 20. And the last example is -5. Oh, sorry, I forgot to write for this. This is y equals 0. This is y equals -5. So if I'm scanning my second row, do you see a -5 on my second row? I see -1, 4, 4, 2, 9, 8, 0. I don't see a -5, so if I don't see it in that row that I'm looking at, it's undefined. Now, I want to say something about the undefined, because the mistake that students usually do is they say, oh, I have to look for -5. I don't see it in the second row, but I do see it on the first row. But don't do that, because it's not asking us, is x equals -5? Because remember, this value is an x value. I mean, if you're in the right row and you don't see a -5, then we say it's undefined. Same thing for this example on the left. We said that we're specifically looking for an x of -1. So we look at the first row, because all these values on the first row are x's, and if you can't find a -1 in the first row, because we're looking at x's, then we say undefined. Now again, students make the mistake and they say, oh, I can't find -1 on the first row, but I found it on the second row. But this is wrong, because we're not supposed to look at the second row if they're telling us to look at the first row of the x row. Okay, so make sure, that's just a warning I want to tell you guys, make sure that you're looking at the correct numbers, the correct row, so that you can make sure, if you can't find it on that row, then it's undefined. All right, so thank you for joining me for this video. I'll see you guys in our next Zoom session. But in our next Zoom session, I can answer any questions you have. But I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in class.